So Richard, you've got about 10 years plus experience as a discrimination and employment lawyer. Could you tell us a little bit about the Sex Discrimination Act and what that means?
Sure. So the Sex Discrimination Act chiefly was an act that applies today that protects employees on basic characteristics. And this act focuses on things like someone's sex, someone's family responsibilities, someone's sexual orientation, or for example, things like pregnancy. And what this act does is it focuses on particular areas of life, and it creates particular categories such as, for us, our experience is employment. And there are particular sections of this act, and the main one that comes to mind is section 14, which says that forms of discrimination on the basis of someone's sex is prohibited. And it creates particular categories of prohibited conduct.
So what are some examples of how sex discrimination can occur in a workplace, Richard?
Sure. So what section 14 does is it focuses on particular areas of prohibited conduct, such as workplace warnings, such as dismissal, such as detriments, such as, for example, denying people a benefit in someone's workplace. And it then gives particular categories of, if you like, characteristics that people have that you can't discriminate against. So let's give an example. Section 14 might deal with a workplace warning. You can't, an employer cannot take a detriment against an employee on the basis of, for example, someone's parental responsibilities. Let's dig a bit deeper. Let's assume, for example, that an employee has to, because of their parental or family responsibilities, leave work at 3 p.m. and it's an urgent situation because their child's at school and the child is sick.
Yeah.
On the following day, the employer comes to the employee and provides the employee a written warning for having to leave work to go and attend to their parental responsibilities. And assuming, for example, a medical certificate was provided, it's entirely possible that that particular employee can allege that there was a breach of section 14 of the Act because they were subject to detriment. The detriment was the workplace warning, and of course the workplace warning was provided to the employee simply because they had to be absent from work to look after their child or their son or their daughter who was sick at work.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So you talked a little bit about characteristics.
Sure.
Can you tell us what a characteristic of someone's sex might mean and how that plays out in reality in the workplace?
Sure. So the drafters of the legislation were quite clever. So if we look at section 5, for example, section 5 is the overarching, I suppose, section that deals with particularly discrimination on the basis of someone's sex. But of course, the intricacies of how an employment works and how policies and procedures are put in place doesn't always accord with, let's say, direct forms of discrimination. So let's again pick this apart a bit more. Let's assume an employee or employer has a policy that says all employees have to start work at 9 a.m. in the morning. Okay. Now, on the face of it, you might think, well, that policy doesn't deal with someone's sex, it doesn't discriminate. But when you dig a bit deeper, someone who's a female might have a certain characteristic that they're also a mother. And a certain characteristic of a mother is they will have family responsibilities. So entirely possible that that policy actually indirects those employees in that workplace who are females, and a characteristic of a female might be that they are a mother, and another characteristic might be that they have family responsibilities because at 9 a.m. they have to take their children to school. So that's how the characteristics are kind of worked into the legislation.
Yeah, makes sense. And we often associate sex discrimination and the Sex Discrimination Act with women. But can you tell us a little bit about how men are protected by the legislation as well?
Sure. So I guess an interesting part of this legislation, of course, is that the legislation doesn't differentiate between females and males in the ordinary sense. So again, coming back to section 5, it simply says an employer cannot discriminate on the basis of someone's sex. It doesn't matter if they're male or it doesn't matter if they're female. If you wanted to tease that out a little bit more, I accept that generally when we think about the Sex Discrimination Act, we think about females being discriminated against in the workplace. But it can also happen to men and males. You might have a situation there where a male, entirely possible, is also a father, and entirely possible also has family and care responsibilities. In fact, it might even be possible that that father needs to, again, leave work early at 3 o'clock to go and look after their sick son or daughter because they're unwell, and the Act will apply to that father as it does to a mother.
In the same way.
In exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And it's actually interesting because a lot of employers, unfortunately, don't associate men with having family and care responsibilities. They associate women with having family and care responsibilities. So it's entirely possible on the following that day, that employer might be a bit more irate that the male father went out to look after the child rather than the mother. And we have a lot of phone calls with, as you would know, fathers who call up and say, my manager said to me words to the effect, well, why couldn't your wife go and pick up the child, or why couldn't your mother go pick up the child? And the father says, well, I'm the father, I have the same responsibilities.
Great, yeah. Thanks very much, Richard, for that explanation of the Sex Discrimination Act.
Absolutely.